Good morning to everyone. My name is Darren Northcott. I'm the National Official for Education at the NHWT. And what we want to do this morning is spend an hour or so just talking about some of your rights and entitlements as new teachers who will be beginning your careers from this September. I've got some slides I'm going to go through. Don't worry about trying to scribble everything down. You'll get copies of the slides afterwards. So what I'll do is I'll talk through some of the key points about induction that in our view we think you need to kind of be aware of in the months and the years to come, as it were. But then what I'll also do is try and create some time at the end of the session where if you've got any questions that you don't think I've addressed in the presentation, and there are lots of good questions that I'm not going to be able to address in the presentation because of time, then pop those in the Q&A. It's probably better to do that in the Q&A than in the chat, I would suggest. And then we'll go through those at the end. If there's any that kind of pick on particular points or issues or questions that I haven't addressed or you want a bit more information on, that's probably the best way of doing it. What I would also say is that the Q&A is probably better because it's confidential. So if you want to lodge a particular question that you're a bit sensitive about, perhaps do that through the Q&A rather than through the chat. What I will say right at the beginning is that we're here to support you. So if you are sitting there and you have some concerns about what might happen in September, you're a bit concerned about your circumstances in the school or the setting where you're going to be working, the best thing to do is to contact us directly. So all the information is on our website, but it's to have a kind of more detailed confidential chat about any particular concern you've got with your employer. But if you want to put the question in the Q&A, that's probably the best way to go about it. I'm going to share my screen. Let's try and do that, so bear with me. Hopefully you can all see that. Let me just move that there. And start. Excellent. So hopefully you can all see that. As I say, don't try and scribble everything down. We'll get these slides to you. There are other sources of advice and guidance that I'll talk about as we go on. So just to think about being a new teacher in 2021, and when I was thinking about this presentation this morning, I was reminded of the fact that I was in your position, about to start my career as a teacher, having finished my initial teacher training 27 years ago now. So I qualified as a primary school teacher, and as you can probably imagine, there have been a lot of changes in that time. Some things have changed a lot. I have to say some things have stayed pretty much exactly the same. And one of the things that has stayed the same is that when you begin your careers as new teachers, people around you, particularly the people to whom you're accountable in your school or your setting, are going to spend a lot of time reminding you, excuse me, of your responsibilities. And that's probably as it should be, because teaching is an extremely responsible job. It's extremely responsible in terms of the individual children that you're teaching, because you're responsible for their progress and achievement, but it's socially responsible as well. So it's an incredibly important job in our society, and part of our role is to make sure that governments and employers understand that, do the best by the teachers who they give the responsibility for teaching and learning day in, day out in classrooms. So it is a very responsible job, and no one's going to run away from that fact. I'm sure you won't, I think any right-minded person would. But you also have important rights. You can't discharge those responsibilities unless the rights that you have are respected. So rights and responsibilities are balanced. If your rights aren't respected, as teachers generally, but particularly for purposes of our discussion this morning, your rights as new teachers, if those aren't respected, then how can anyone reasonably expect you to discharge your responsibilities? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the most important rights that you've got as new teachers. And I'm also going to touch on the early career framework as well, because that has an important set of implications for your rights, but we'll come on to that a little bit later. One thing you can't get away from, and we'll go with it now, are the teacher standards, because the teacher standards are the standards that you have to demonstrate that you've met in order to complete your induction successfully. And we've got, I think, in England, personally, a rather anomalous system, and it's a question that lots of new teachers ask, which is, how is it the standards I had to meet in order to gain QTS and complete my initial teacher training successfully, how is it that those standards are also the standards that I have to meet in order to demonstrate that I've completed induction successfully? How can we have two standards, two sort of sets of assessments, as it were, based on exactly the same set of standards? And that's a really good question. Back in the day, years ago, there were two different sets of standards. There was one for achieving QTS, and there was another set of standards for passing induction. About 10 years ago now, those are merged together into a single set of standards. The best way, I think, the best way of thinking about teacher standards as new teachers undertaking induction is perhaps to recognize, to try and make sense of that, is to try and recognize that what you're trying to do as new teachers is demonstrate that you can meet the teacher standards, but in a different context. And the different context, obviously, is that you're employed or engaged as teachers in a professional capacity. You have the responsibilities that you didn't have when you were undertaking initial teacher training. You now have those responsibilities as employed teachers. Can you show that you can meet those standards in that different context? So the aim of the game at the end of induction is to show that you've met the standards in that context. I'm not going to go into detail about how you might do that. There's a lot of information in the on our website, and particularly, which I'll point you to now, there's some information on our website about how you as new teachers can demonstrate your progress towards the teacher standards. You've got to demonstrate that you've met all the standards, but there are good ways of doing it. There are bad ways of doing it. There are burdensome and time-consuming ways of doing it. There are streamlined ways of doing it as well. So understanding what the standards mean in your context as a new teacher is really important. But if at any point, they are so important to induction, if at any point you're concerned about the standards, interpretation of the standards in your setting, and obviously if you're going to meet those standards, if you're concerned that perhaps there's a suggestion in your school that you might not meet those standards, then it's really important that you come and speak to us, and we will give you the advice and information and support to help you address the problems that may come up. I have to say, again, I think right at the outset, is that the vast majority of new teachers, induction has always been a really positive process. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are difficulties, but it is a positive process. And the vast majority of new teachers, in whatever circumstances, complete induction successfully. So it's something where you should be going into this, given all the training you've got, feeling really confident that you're well placed to meet those standards at the end of your induction, and continue your careers as qualified teachers. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about the early career framework, which I'm absolutely certain you are all familiar with. This is a substantial change in many important respects. Some important things remain the same. We might touch on that. But this is a change in the way in which induction is organised in England. And if I were you, and I were sitting where you're sitting now, thinking about the relevance of this, I might say to myself, well, I'm not particularly concerned about what the old arrangements were. What matters to me is what the new arrangements are. I understand those new arrangements, and I can then undertake my induction with an understanding of how things are now, not how things were previously. That is a completely rational and sensible way of looking at things. The only reason I would flag the ECF is that in some respects for you, the ECF is what you're focusing on, and the requirements that go around the ECF, the new induction regulations will come onto that, the new statutory guidance that governs induction. But for your settings, so for the schools, your employers, the schools you work, the settings in which you're working, this is quite a big change. And they are spending time getting their heads around what this change means. So the reason I would argue it's useful to know about the ECF and what went on before is, if anything, just to understand that your employers, your schools are going through a process of trying to adapt what they were doing previously to what's expected now. So that, I think, is an important thing for you to bear in mind, because we've had induction up to last academic year, that framework. We've had that framework in place since 2001, so almost 20 years. And there were some changes to the way in which induction was organised, but by and large, it remained pretty much the same. And schools were able to get used to that, and they understood it. They were very familiar with it. And before 2001, there was no statutory induction at all. So when I started teaching, that was in the early 90s, there was no statutory induction. It was entirely up to each individual employer to decide to do whatever it wanted to do with its new teachers. Some employers had quite good induction programs, some had none whatsoever. Induction for many new teachers way back in the 90s was you were shown a classroom and you were told just to get on with it, and that was the extent of your induction. So we campaigned quite strongly for a kind of program of induction, a structure for induction, and it was introduced in 2001. The early career framework is an attempt on the part of the government to address what previous cohorts of newly qualified teachers identified as shortcomings in the arrangements for induction in some circumstances. So one of the issues that was raised often, quite frequently by new teachers was the kind of variability in practice. It was the fact that in some places induction seemed to go well, in other cases the levels of support given to new teachers were sort of less consistent and less effective. So what the early career framework is an attempt to do is to provide a better package of support for new teachers as they enter the profession. That is the intention behind the early career framework. Some things remain the same. This is really important. But induction is, to use the jargon, it's a legally framed process. So it always was, and it will continue to be a legally framed process. That means that all the rights we're going to talk about in a minute, all the expectations on employers, are not optional extras. They're not things that schools can choose to do or choose not to do. They're things that schools are required to do if they choose to employ new teachers. So what the early career framework does is underpinned by that kind of legal foundation. And that is incredibly important to bear in mind. But the ECF introduces new rights and entitlements for new teachers. One of the issues that I think schools are still going to take a little bit of time to get their head around is that the cohorts of new teachers that went before you were referred to as newly qualified teachers. In the regulations, the guidance, all the material the government has put together for new teachers in induction are referred to as ECTs, early career teachers. So if someone calls you an NQT, you need to kind of bear in mind that, of course, under the new arrangement, it's ECTs. Everything you'll see from us, everything you'll see from the government, will talk about ECTs, not NQTs. And another reassuring point, I think, that it's worth bearing in mind is that under the early career framework, the experience you get should be at least as good as what went before. So this is about, if it's about anything, it's about providing you with an even better experience than the experiences that previous NQT cohorts were entitled to and experienced in practice. One point to emphasize is that we know, and you know as well as anyone, that the education system was placed under tremendous pressure as a result of the pandemic. And the pandemic has impacted on day-to-day lives of teachers and of pupils and of school communities in a really profound way. And we know that those implications are going to continue on into the new academic year. So these aren't necessarily the best of circumstances within which to introduce the ECF. And I think that is widely recognised. But the ECF is being introduced. So I think it's important to bear in mind that schools are trying to deal with the ECF in what are pretty challenging circumstances. But as far as you're concerned, the bottom line should continue to be, and you should note all of that, you should note the difficult circumstances, of course you should. But the bottom line for you needs to be that if a school chooses to employ you, which all your schools have done or will do, if your school chooses to employ you as an ECT, as a new teacher, then it is accepting that it will provide you with all your rights and entitlements under the ECF and that are set out in law, in the regulations and the guidance. So if schools choose to employ new teachers, they take on those responsibilities and you are guaranteed those rights. That is a really important point. Putting it really bluntly, if schools don't think that they can provide those rights, they've got no business employing new teachers. So every school that's employed you has signed up to meeting your rights and your entitlements under the ECF. As I say, we've got advice and guidance. Do look on our website. We'll get that sent to you as well. Advice and guidance on the ECF, how it works, what your entitlements are in detail. That will be on our website. And we're always here to support you if you have any concerns, as I said, any problems, any worries, no matter how minor you think they are, we're here to talk those through with you. The other point I'll say before we move on is that this is new, and there's still, I think, in the system, a sense in which people are getting to grips with it and trying to work out what it means. We are continuing our discussions with the government on the early career framework. It's a key priority for us that new teachers get the best possible experience. The government promises that the ECF will provide a better experience for new teachers than what went before, but your feedback is really important. So we will set up opportunities, look out for those later on in the year, for you as new teachers to come together, perhaps virtually, maybe even in the physical realm, who knows, but opportunities for you to come together, get more input, more support, more advice, more information, but also an opportunity for you to share your feedback with us about how induction is going. So I can't emphasize enough, your feedback is absolutely critical. So let's look at some of your rights and entitlements under ECF. I've picked 10, there are more, but I think these are 10 that tend to come up more often than not. So let's, without any further ado, look at these really important 10 rights and entitlements you have as new teachers. First one I've started with, and the reason I start with it is because it's the one that I think attracts most attention, and it is really important, is you're entitled to a reduction in timetable teaching time. And in your first year of induction, that reduction is 10% of your timetable teaching time. In your second year, that will be 5% reduction in timetable teaching time. It's really important. One of the changes, of course, that leads us to is the fact that under the early career framework, the induction period is now 2 years, not 1 year. So you've got 10% reduction in timetable teaching time in the first year, and then you've got 5% reduction in timetable teaching time in the second year. The way you calculate that is really straightforward. The reduction in timetable teaching time is just take the normal timetable in your school, you work out 10% of it, and then you deduct that. So that period of time, you should be away from your classroom, working on activities focused on your induction. That's in addition to, in almost all cases, not all, it depends where you work, but if you're working in a state-funded school, this will almost always be the case. It's absolutely the case if you're working, excuse me, in a local authority maintained school, is that you'll have also, in addition to that, an entitlement to a reduction in timetable teaching time for PPA, planning, preparation, and assessment. Slightly annoyingly, they are calculated on a slightly different basis, but a rough rule of thumb is that if you're a new teacher, you've got your reduction timetable teaching time. Because you're a new teacher undertaking induction, you've got your PPA time. That should equate to, over a week, the equivalent of 1 day out of 5 away from the classroom, either doing PPA or having your induction time. Those should be clearly marked on your timetable as well, so you should know when that time is going to be. It doesn't necessarily have to be every week, so it can be calculated on a fortnightly basis. The key point is at the end of the year, it all has to add up to that 10% reduction for induction and the 10% reduction for PPA time. And it also needs to be in meaningful blocks. So again, there's nothing hard and fast about this, but our advice would be that if your PPA time is going to be helpful to you, if your induction time is going to be helpful to you, then the time away from the classroom should be at least half an hour. So periods of time away from the classroom that are less than half an hour, probably not going to be much use to you. Final point I'll make about the reduction is that the pro rata principle applies. So for example, if you were to be working on a 0.5 contract, then you take half the timetable, you work out 10% of that, so you can work out your induction time and your excuse me, and your PPA time as well. So really important to try and calculate that. If we take the full-time equivalent of the discussion, if you take a week, PPA induction time should be roughly 1 day out of 5 that you're not in front of the classroom. So it's a really important, right? And again, if you're not getting that right, or you're not certain about how it's calculated in your case, do come and see us and we will talk you through that. The second right here is not teaching outside the age range or subject for which you have been trained. That is important. And in the primary sector, normally not a particular issue. We have in this country a general kind of model still, where if you're a primary teacher, you're allocated your class and you teach that class. So generally that isn't an issue for new teachers working in the primary sector. One thing for primary teachers to bear in mind though, is that technically your school can ask you to teach any of the year groups within that school. So if you take a primary school that's got year R up to year 6, then you can be asked to teach any of those year groups. What a sensible school will do is it will focus on making sure that certainly in your induction, you're teaching within the range you were trained for. So that's mainly the case if you were teaching, let's say your training focused on children aged 3 to 7, then making sure that you were teaching reception, perhaps nursery, up to year 2, maybe year 3, depending on the course. If you were teaching, if your course was focused on children aged 5 to 11, then it's probably not, it's permissible, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily the best practice without support to ask you to teach reception if you've had no experience previously of the early years foundation stage. So, but primary generally isn't an issue that comes up a lot. In the secondary sector, most secondary teachers, or certainly lots of secondary teachers, have a second subject. So if you're a geography teacher, that you can offer some music, then that can be a really good thing. Certainly help your employability. If you're going for jobs in future and you say, well, my main subject is geography, but I can also offer music, I can offer Key Stage 3 music perhaps, then schools will say that's really helpful, and that means that you're able to contribute more to the teaching in the school, and it may make you more attractive to future employers. So nothing wrong with having a second subject. Lots of teachers, lots of secondary teachers, they quite like having a second subject. It kind of adds a bit of breadth and variety to their teaching. So absolutely not a problem, but in your induction, in the first 2 years of your teaching, it's going to be important that you are spending all or most, the substantial majority of your time focused on the subject for which you were trained. There's a really good reason for that. Because what you're trying to do in induction is demonstrate you can build on your initial teacher training in an employed context. And it's very difficult to do that if you're not focusing on the subjects you were trained to teach. So again, come and talk to us if you're in a school where you're spending a pretty substantial amount of your time teaching a subject you weren't trained for. Schools know they shouldn't do that. If you're spending a little bit of time on your second subject, so let's say you have one lesson timetable per week in your second subject, maybe two, depends on the circumstances, depends to some extent how confident you feel, that might be okay. If all your timetable or great swathes of it are taken up teaching subjects you weren't trained for, that is an issue. Your school knows it shouldn't be doing that. So if that is happening, you need to come and speak to us. Third right, really important that you access and experience the planning procedures used by other teachers. This is getting better. If I went back 10 years ago, this was a big problem, but it still comes up every now and again. You should be using the planning that every other teacher is using. You should actually be following all the processes that every other teacher is using. There was a tendency in the past for schools to say, well, we have planning that we expect the generality of our teachers to undertake, but for our new teachers, we expect them to do more detailed planning. The time for you to do that has passed. That's something you would have experienced when you were undertaking your initial teacher training. Everyone who undertook initial teacher training, you more recently than any other cohort will know that often it was about writing very extended lesson plans so you could demonstrate that you understood how to plan a lesson. Okay, fair enough. You've got QTS now. Because you've got QTS, you've shown you wouldn't have QTS if you didn't know how to plan a lesson. You've got a career ahead of you to refine that, to build on those skills, but the core of it, you know, and we know you know because you've got qualified teacher status. So you should be using the same planning procedures that everyone else is using. So again, if you're working in a school where they ask you to do routinely really detailed planning that no other teacher is asked to do, the school knows it shouldn't be doing that, and you need to come and talk to us about how we might deal with that situation best. For example, there might be some exceptions. So if you're having a lesson observation with your mentor and you really want to focus on one aspect of your practice, then you might write a more extended plan, that one-off observation. That's probably fine. Needs to be discussed between you and the mentor, but that's probably going to be okay. But if every single week you are having to, in every single half term or term, you're having to write much longer, more detailed plans than everyone else, that really isn't good practice. Your school knows it. Really key part of the ECF is you have an entitlement to support from a mentor. Now, there's always been a requirement in the induction regulations and statutory guidance for all NQTs to have a mentor, but this was one of the issues that NQTs would often point to as perhaps something of a shortcoming in their experience. And the reason it was a shortcoming was usually because the mentor didn't have enough time because they've got their teaching to focus on, and may have other responsibilities as well. They weren't given enough time and they weren't given enough training to give you as new teachers the support that you're entitled to. So one of the big shifts that we're seeing with the early career framework is a much stronger focus on mentoring. So under the early career framework, your school has certain expectations about your school. Those relate to the training your mentor receives. So your mentor should receive training. Many mentors have never been trained to undertake that job. Making sure they get that training is a key part of the early career framework. And also time. So a rough rule of thumb, again, it's not carved in stone, but it is a kind of guideline, is your mentor should get about 20 hours a year release time from their other duties to focus on each new teacher for whom they are responsible. So that support from a mentor is really key. If we can improve the support that you as new teachers get from mentors and give mentors the support, because they want to do the best job they can, give them support that they need to do that, then the experience should be better. Just one key point to note is that the mentor role and the tutor role, you also have a tutor. One of the principles of the ECF is that those roles, wherever possible, become separated. So the mentor's focus is on that professional support, developing, coaching, mentoring in its true sense. And the tutor's role is to make assessments periodically and the final recommendation to the head teacher normally as to whether you can induction. There's a lot of debate about that in the development of the ECF. Some people felt that it's probably better if the mentor and the tutor are the same role. That was the historical model. The person giving you the support was also the person who undertook assessments of your progress, formal assessments of your progress. The mentor will do that kind of formative assessment of your progress, of course, and tutors will also draw upon the mentor in forming their assessment. But interestingly, general feedback from previous NQTs was that they would have preferred it had the two roles been separated. And the reason for that, because a lot of new teachers felt more comfortable talking honestly about their practice to a mentor if they knew that that mentor wasn't responsible for the assessment. So that's where the government landed. There was a big debate about that. That's where the government landed. We'll have to monitor that carefully. But the core, I think, issue for you is that you need to have a mentor identified to support you, and that mentor must be supported. So part of your right is a mentor who is supported. Mentors are our members too, so we want to make sure they're supported. But from your point of view, you need that mentor to have time, space, and training to give you the support that you need. So it's a really key right that you have. This is an interesting one. It is in the regulations, it is in the guidance, but it's not to teach routinely classes or individual children with particularly challenging discipline problems. So how do we make sense of that? Well, I think the best way to start thinking about this is to recognize that it's actually important in your induction, and is required in induction, that you are given opportunities to demonstrate and further develop your skills in behavior management. If there is a school or a class anywhere in the country where a teacher doesn't have to exercise skill, knowledge, and expertise on behavior management, I would like to hear about it. My assumption is that class doesn't exist. So every class will require you to implement strategies to sustain and promote good behavior. Absolutely, it's really key. It's one of the things your mentor will be looking out for. Of course, you would expect that. But it's important that you're given a fair opportunity to do that. So what this provision tries to do is to say to schools, in effect, look, you know that in your school there are some classes and perhaps some individual children who present behavior challenges that are beyond those that are presented by the majority of children in the school. I would challenge any school that turned around and said, well, we don't know which classes are the most challenging in the school or which pupils are the most challenging in the school. You will have lots of opportunities later on in your career to work with those classes, and it's important that you do. But in your induction, it's important that you don't get, at the moment yet, to teach those classes or to teach those pupils. So schools have to think about the behavior challenges that you will encounter during your induction. And this is not a perfect requirement, because an obvious challenge to it is to say, well, take my experience, for example. The school in which I worked in, so I'm thinking of the school that I worked in, where the most challenging class, and everyone in the school knew it was the most challenging class, if you took that class and dropped it into the next school I went to work in, it would probably be one of the better behaved classes. So it's all relative, of course it is. But what this requires your school to do is to think about which classes you should teach now and which classes perhaps you should take on at a later date. So they need to consider that. Again, if you're not clear that that has happened in your school, and you probably won't know until you've got some way down the line in terms of your induction and you get to know some of the other classes and other children in your school, and you think, well, hang on a minute, this really is the most challenging class in this school. I'm not sure why I've got it. Come and talk to us and we'll give you some support and talk you through how we might deal with it. You've got the right to teach the same classes on a regular basis. Really important. One of the things you're going to have to demonstrate is that you can establish and maintain an effective professional relationship with the classes that you teach. So that's a really key part of effective teaching. You will know that. You can only really do that if you're working on a routine basis with the same children. Supply teaching, doing daily supply teaching, is a very particular skill, and it's something that requires a lot of experience to kind of undertake effectively. Of course it does. But during your induction, one of the opportunities you get through your induction is to show that you can develop and sustain that relationship over time. It's really important that you get the opportunity to do that. Really key. You can't do that if you don't get the opportunity to teach the same class or classes on a regular basis. Almost always it isn't a problem in the primary sector, because if you're a primary teacher, primary colleagues, you'll get your class, you'll be allocated that class. Sure, that class may be taught by another teacher for a particular subject. So it's quite common in primary school. Certainly every primary school I worked in, we had a teacher who taught music. So my class would be taught by someone else for music. There are certainly schools where some teachers swapped around. So some teachers would go and teach the parallel class maths, and the other teacher would teach the parallel class English. That happens from time to time. That's fine, but you're going to get pretty much a fair opportunity to build a relationship with your class. In the secondary sector, again, it tends not to be too much of an issue, thankfully, and that's mainly because, and secondary colleagues, you will know this, the amount of time, effort, sweat and tears that secondary schools put into organising their timetable really is something to behold. And so sensible schools are loath to change that timetable during the course of the year. Sometimes, very rarely, they have to, but there has to be a really good reason why they do it. So the last thing any secondary school wants to do that's sensible is start tinkering around, not only with a timetable, with which teacher is allocated to which class, but it can happen. So if you're in a situation where you're not really teaching the same classes on a regular basis, come talk to us, because that's not giving you a fair opportunity to demonstrate that you meet teacher standards at the end of your induction. You've got a right to regular feedback about your progress. That is your mentor's job, fundamentally, to give you that regular feedback. And that's one of the reasons why, to some extent, the government decided to separate the tutor and mentor role, so you get that regular feedback. You'll have formal assessments of your progress. Those will take place for a full-time equivalent colleague at the end of year one and at the end of your induction. That's when the recommendation will be made. And you'll get progress reviews at the end of each term where there isn't a formal assessment. That's all important, but you need that regular feedback so that you can continue to refine and develop your practice. That's really important. So again, giving the mentor the time to work with you means that you should be getting regular feedback about your progress, what's going well, or what are the next steps in your journey as qualified teachers, or the areas you want to focus on in terms of your development. If you look back historically, if NQTs were dissatisfied with their induction, this usually came, if not at the top of the list of concerns, near the top of the list of concerns. They weren't getting the feedback that they felt was important, and that I think everyone recognizes is important. You've got a right to a comprehensive program of support during your induction. Again, this is what the ECF is supposed to be all about. It's worth noting, and if you look on our website, if you just type early career framework, there's some advice, more detailed advice and guidance on the early career framework up on the website. But schools have got options, they've got choices about which ways do they want to put in place to undertake the early career framework. Almost all schools, I'll say that confidently, if I'm proved wrong in a term's time, I'll put my hands up and admit it. But my confident prediction would be that over 95% of schools are going to choose what's known as the full program. So this is a provider-led program. And what the full program involves is schools selecting one of 6 providers. So 6 providers that have been approved by the government, and that provider provides a kind of, if you like, packaged program of support that schools can use. So in effect, that provider provides the materials, the resources, the training for mentors, particularly. Schools can take that and they use that program to organise their induction for their new teachers and to support new teachers learning throughout their induction. So in a sense, schools don't have to develop this themselves. It's all done for them by an external provider. External providers have been quality assured. I would say almost all schools, particularly in the first couple of years of the ECF, that's the route they're going to go down. So for you as new teachers, if you're not aware already, it might be worth finding out whether your school is doing or using that full provider route, that external provider route. If it is, which of the 6 external providers you're going to use. And if you want to find out the identities of those 6 providers, on our website, but that gives you a chance to familiarize yourselves with the support package that will be used with your induction. There are 2 other routes I'll mention very briefly. One is what's known as the core route, the core approach, and that core approach is where a school decides it doesn't want to use materials produced by one of the 6 external providers. It will instead use materials that have been produced by the Department for Education, and it will implement those itself. So it doesn't draw upon the materials that have been produced by one of those providers. It takes a core package that's produced by the DFE, and it uses that package for its own induction. It has to meet all the requirements. So everything I've said so far, everything's set out in terms of the regulations and the guidance, no matter what route has been chosen. School has to do it, but that's another option that a school can choose. Again, I don't think many schools, particularly in the early days, are going to do that, but if they do, it doesn't relieve them of any responsibilities to give you the support you're entitled to. The final option, which I don't think many schools are going to take, but some might, particularly the bigger multi-academy trusts, we'll have to wait and see, is what's known as the kind of school-led program. And this is where the school doesn't use the DFE's resources, doesn't use the 6 external providers' resources, it develops its own resources. So some of the big MATs might choose to do that. Some of them might choose to do it, it won't affect you. Some of them might choose to do it in the years ahead. But they have that option if they want to use it. Our intelligence is very few schools are going to use that option. But again, if they do, they have to make sure they're subject to more monitoring as well if they do that, to make sure that their materials and their approach is up to scratch. But even if they do that, it's not an approach that a school can choose if it were minded to say, well, we don't want to provide our new teachers with all their rights and entitlements. No matter what school you're working in, no matter what delivery route is chosen by your school for the ECF, they've got to meet all your rights and entitlements. It's really important. You've got a right to have early warning if there are any problems or difficulties with your teaching practice or perceived problems with your teaching practice. So if you get a sense, it can sometimes be just a sense, that your school doesn't necessarily have full confidence at the end of your induction you're going to meet the teacher standards, and it may ask you, for example, to extend your induction so that you can meet the teacher standards. That's something schools, in rare circumstances, that's something that schools can do. If you are concerned about that, or particularly if you're told that there are concerns about your performance or a risk that you might not be assessed as meeting the teacher standards at the end of your induction, it's absolutely essential that you come and see us. As soon as you have that concern, you need to come and see us. Don't sit worrying on your own in silence, even if you think your concerns might be overblown, or you might even think you're exaggerating. Always better. There is nothing to be lost by coming to speak with us. It will be confidential. We'll talk you through how things stand, whether we think there is an issue, and if there is an issue, what we can do to support you in dealing with it. So that's what we're here for. Do come and see us if you have any concerns, or if you're told there might be concerns about you meeting induction, and that's whenever that takes place during your induction. Schools should communicate that as early as possible. Some don't, but from your point of view, as soon as you are concerned, if you have any worries in that respect at all, come and see us and we'll talk you through it. And finally, this isn't stated expressly in the induction regulations or in the guidance, but I think it's implied throughout, is you've got a right to be treated as a professional. It's really important that you are. You are holders of qualified teacher status, and that means you are qualified teachers, and that puts you on an equal status to everyone else in your school who's got qualified teacher status. You will hold that same status. That doesn't mean, and I'm sure this is something that you will all recognize, that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot you can learn and a lot you should learn from those colleagues who are a bit further down the track. So those colleagues with a bit more experience, of course you will learn from them, draw on their expertise and their support. So really positive thing about teaching is that kind of mutual support between colleagues. But fundamentally, it's really important that you begin your first day of teaching as a qualified teacher, you begin your induction with a clear understanding in your own mind that you are a qualified teacher, you have that status, and that allows you to do work that only those that hold qualified teacher status can undertake. That's a really important consideration in terms of your professionalism, and you should be treated as a professional, as a QTS holder. It's really key. One of the key things you can do to insist that you're treated as a professional is to insist you get your rights and entitlements as teachers. And if you don't get those rights and entitlements, come and see us and we can talk it through and make sure that you do get those rights and entitlements. There's lots of ways you can get support and advice from us. The main way, your first port of call will be the member support advice line. You can contact them by telephone or by email. That's the first place you would go to if you need support and advice. We have, the union is organised into local associations. So they are the local member-led branches, which is often the term used in other organisations for the union. They're led by members. Their activities are run for the benefit of members. We urge you to get involved in your local association, not least because it's a really good way of meeting other teachers in other schools in your area. It can be very enlightening to hear the experiences of teachers working in other schools. We all as teachers can get very locked into our school's way of doing things, our school's ways of managing behaviour, our school's way of assessing. That's, I think, an occupational hazard for teachers. Good antidote for that is getting involved in your local association, where you will get to meet teachers in other schools and you will learn about good practice and you'll learn a lot more about the other things we do as a union to represent your interests. A network of regional and national centres. They're staffed with particularly experienced colleagues who are there to support and advise in cases where there are potentially issues or problems that members experience. And look out for our induction planner as well. That will be coming to you very shortly. That induction planner has everything I've said this morning and more. So it's a really good source of advice, guidance, hints and tips about how to get the most out of your induction. And all of that is available on our website. So I'll stop talking there. It's probably more than enough. And let's have a look at any questions that have been popped into the Q&A. Can't see any, so that I always take as meaning that I've answered every question that you came along with. So hopefully that has answered some of your questions that you have about induction. Please do look out for further updates that we provide, will provide during the course of the year. Also look out for those opportunities for you to come together again partway through your induction to get some more advice, some more input, some more support from ourselves and from others with expertise that we bring in to those sessions, but also it's a chance for you to feedback and share your experiences, so it can be really worthwhile. I think I've got someone's popped a question. Bear with me. That question's gone into the Q&A. I think it's in the chat. Never mind. But yes, Anjum, hello Anjum. You've asked a question about how do you calculate the reduced timetable. Can I go through it again? I will go through that again. It can be a bit daunting, but it's really quite straightforward. So going back to this point about the reduced timetable, remember there are two dimensions to it in almost all cases. In all cases, so even if you're working in an independent school that's offering induction, in all cases you get the 10% reduction in timetable teaching time because you're undertaking induction. And I would say in almost all other cases, you'll get PPA time as well. That's 10%. To calculate the amount of time, roughly, you take the timetable in your setting over the course of the week. So that is a normal timetable during the course of the week. You then calculate 10% of that. So you calculate 10% of that timetable, and then you deduct that in terms of the amount of classroom contact time that you have. So if it was 10%, that roughly equates to a session, so a morning or an afternoon. If you add PPA time on top of that, then broadly speaking, if you're working full-time equivalent, you should be getting the equivalent of, there are 5 days a week. One of those days, the equivalent of one of those days, you aren't timetabled to teach. That could be a morning session on a Tuesday and an afternoon session on a Thursday. That's fine, absolutely. You can calculate it over 2 weeks, so that would be 2 days out of 10. Some schools do it that way. The key point to bear in mind is that you need to know when that time is going to be, so it should be marked clearly on your personal timetable. And also the blocks of time need to be meaningful. And our advice is that they have to be half an hour or longer. If it's less than half an hour, so if you have 20 minutes here, 15 minutes here, 10 minutes here, 25 minutes here, then that really isn't enough time for you to sustain any meaningful activity. It's certainly not going to be enough time for you to engage with the ECF. So again, it's something that most schools get right. I'll reassure you, most schools get this right, but the block of time has to be enough for you to do something meaningful with it. So that's how you calculate that. So look at another couple of questions that will come up in the Q&A. When should you expect, this is from Amy, good morning Amy. Amy asks, when should we expect to hear about training days if induction is being provided through an external provider, such as the Ambition Institute? The Ambition Institute is one of the 6 external providers. You should get that information in advance. So effectively, what you should do at the start of term is you should be given information about when those are going to take place, because they need to coincide with your 10% reduction in timetable teaching time, because that would be one way in which that time can be used. Some schools might choose, they don't have to, but they might choose to provide access to training days on top of the 10% reduction in timetable teaching time. Bear in mind, they don't have to do that, but some might choose to do it, but you need enough notice. I think some of the days are probably not in the calendar yet. So you should at least know, certainly within the first fortnight of term, you should at least know when the training days and when the training sessions and when all activities, frankly, in relation to the ECF are going to be conducted. So they should give you enough notice. It shouldn't be, just take an extreme example, it shouldn't be tomorrow we're going to be doing X, Y, or Z training session under the ECF for your induction. You should have notice, you can prepare, you can think about it, you can come to it in a way that allows you to be as reflective as possible to gain as much as you can out of that experience. Question from Harvinder. Good morning, Harvinder. And Harvinder asks, if we don't get an ECT school till now, how long have we left to do it? Right, it's a really good question. There's no limit. So there's no limit on the point between when you gain QTS and when you start your induction. There used to be years ago, some people still get confused about that. There is no limit. You should start it as soon as you can. So you should be looking for opportunities to start your induction, but there's no limit on that. Equally, once you've started your induction, there's no time limit within which you have to complete it. So again, some people do get muddled up with that because years ago there used to be limits. Those all went ages ago. There's no limit. The one thing you might want to bear in mind is that if you're thinking about undertaking what's known as short-term supply work, and for the purposes of the induction regulations, short-term means placements of less than 1 term, so it certainly includes daily or weekly placements. You are allowed to do that, but you can only do it for 5 years. So the date of your first supply short-term, less than a term, short-term supply placement, that then starts the clock running. And you've got a 5-year period within which you can continue to undertake short-term supply work. At the end of that 5-year period, you're no longer permitted to undertake short-term supply work. Your next work must be something that counts towards your induction. And again, rough rule of thumb, that has to be a placement of more than a term. So just bear that in mind, colleagues, if you're thinking about undertaking short-term supply work. Sadia, good morning, Sadia. Sadia asked, what documents would you suggest having as an ECT? Guidance booklets, observation sheet, etc. Go on our website, type in Early Career Framework. There's a list of all the relevant documents that relate to the Early Career Framework. I would say you need certainly our advice and guidance on the Early Career Framework. So go and look at that, make sure you've got that to hand. I wouldn't suggest that you begin on page 1 of the induction statutory guidance and read through it to the end. That's quite a hard read, but know it's there. It might be worth having a quick look through it just to see what it contains and what it doesn't contain. I certainly wouldn't go and download the induction regulations. You don't need to do that because all of those are reflected in the statutory guidance. That's worthwhile. And then also our induction planner, which you'll get very shortly, gives you an at your side guide to all the things you would need to know about your early career framework and your induction. The one thing I would say, just to restate a point, is if your school is using the full routes, using the full approach to delivering the early career framework, then what I would suggest you do is find out which provider it's using. If you go on the gov.uk website, you can find links to that provider's own website, and then that has all the materials that are going to be used in your induction. So familiarizing yourself with your school provider is probably a good use of your time, but don't disappear into the weed. There's a huge amount of guidance. There are guidance. We haven't talked about appropriate bodies, for example. Appropriate bodies are the bodies that are really important. They are often local authorities, but not always. But they're the body that's there to make sure that your school does the right thing. There is really detailed and really important guidance for appropriate bodies on how they do that. And if there are problems, we will use that guidance to represent a member's interests. But in most circumstances, you don't need to be experts on the appropriate body. You don't need to spend, you've got more than enough coming up in terms of engaging with your induction, building on the skills you developed during your initial teacher training, but know that it's there. So many of these things, it's worth knowing they're there. But our advice and guidance gives you the key things that you need to know. But do go and find out if you're using the full provider, which providers your school is using. Make sure you're familiar with those materials. Colleagues, that's 12 o'clock. I'm not going to take up any more of your time during your holiday. I'm very grateful that you've been here this morning. I hope I've repaid that with some useful information. Do keep an eye on the information that we put on our website. Do remember that our job fundamentally is to support you. And if you need that support, you need to come and see us. That's what we're here for. All the very best of luck in your induction. I know it's going to go well. You've got our advice and guidance to help you. You've got our support behind you. You'll get the most out of that. Enjoy the rest of your holiday. Try and get a bit of more of a break. Try and prepare yourself. Get your heads together to start your induction in the best possible frame of mind. Look out for the events that we will run over the course of the next academic year. And I hope to see you at those, perhaps via Zoom, perhaps in the real world, who knows? But whatever happens, keep in touch with us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, stay safe, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.